The strange thing about conversion is that most people trying to do it think they're offering truth. But to the person on the receiving end, it rarely feels like truth. It feels like pressure. It feels like being treated like a problem to solve, a project, a lost sheep, a soul with bad customer service. And that is exactly why so many attempts fail before the conversation even begins. Because what many theists call sharing the truth often sounds, to an atheist, like this: I've already decided what you think, why you think it, and why you're wrong. That is not a conversation. That is a verdict wearing a smile. And once that happens, the rest is almost automatic. The Bible verse, the warning about hell, the line about being angry at God, the claim that, deep down, you really believe. But here's the part people miss. These tactics do not fail because atheists are stubborn. They fail because they misunderstand what atheists actually are, how belief works, and what makes anyone change their mind in the first place. So, let's look at the 4 critical mistakes. And the last one might be the biggest of all, because it quietly poisons every other attempt before a single word is spoken. They confuse disagreement with rebellion. One of the most common mistakes theists make is assuming that atheism is not really disbelief. It is rebellion, a wound, a phase, a tantrum, a grudge against God. And once you start there, you stop listening. Because if you think someone is running from God, then you do not need to understand their reasons. You only need to diagnose them. Suddenly, the atheist is not a person with a conclusion. They are a patient with symptoms. That is why so many atheists hear things like, "You're just angry at God," or "You were hurt by religion," or "One day you'll come back." Notice what those statements do. They turn a disagreement about evidence into a story about emotional malfunction. It is a very tidy trick, a little too tidy, because it allows the believer to avoid the uncomfortable possibility that the atheist understood the claim perfectly well and still rejected it. For many atheists, that is the moment the conversation dies. Not because they were offended, because they were erased. Their actual position never got addressed. Their reasons never got examined. Their words got translated into a more convenient story. And people can feel that instantly. It is like telling a vegetarian, deep down, you actually want steak. No, deep down, Bob wants a nap and lower cholesterol. The deeper problem here is psychological. Many people assume others think the way they do. If faith feels natural to them, then unbelief must be fake, damaged, or incomplete. But that assumption backfires, because atheists usually do not experience their disbelief as rebellion. They experience it as honesty. They looked, they questioned, they waited for something solid, and it was not there. That does not make them morally superior. But it does mean that talking to them as if they are secretly believers in disguise will fail almost every time. And once that mistake is made, the next one usually follows right behind it. Because if you are not listening, you start reaching for authority. They quote the answer instead of proving it. This one happens constantly. A theist makes a claim, the atheist asks for evidence, and the response is a verse. Now, to a believer, that verse may feel powerful, sacred, even final. To an atheist, it often lands with the force of a fridge manual from a brand they do not own. Because quoting scripture only works if both people already agree that scripture carries authority, and that is exactly what the atheist does not grant. This is one of the strangest habits in religious conversations. Atheists are asked to accept the Holy Book as proof of the Holy Book's truth. It is circular, but dressed in ceremonial clothing, so people sometimes pretend not to notice. But atheists notice, immediately, and once again, the conversation starts to feel less like inquiry and more like repetition. You can see why this fails by flipping it around. If a Muslim warned a Christian using the Quran, most Christians would not suddenly panic and say, "Oh no, that settles it." If a Hindu quoted the Vedas to a Baptist, the Baptist would not slap his forehead and say, "Well, butter my biscuits, mystery solved." Why? Because authority is not transferable by assertion. It has to be established first. And this is where many conversion attempts collapse. The person trying to persuade skips the hardest step. They do not show why their source should be trusted. They just act as if trust is already owed. To an atheist, that feels less like an argument and more like being handed a conclusion and told to admire the packaging. Even worse, it can make the theist sound like they are not engaging with the atheist's actual standard for belief at all. Because most atheists are not asking, "What does your book say?" They are asking, "Why should I believe this is true in the first place?" That is a very different question. And when someone keeps answering a different question, the listener eventually stops expecting clarity. But this still is not the most frustrating mistake, because at least quoting scripture is an attempt, however flawed, to provide support. The next mistake is worse. The next one tells the atheist that even their own mind is not theirs to describe. They claim to know the atheist better than the atheist knows themselves. Deep down you believe. That line has probably ended more honest conversations than a fire alarm in a library. Because hidden inside it is an extraordinary claim, not about God. About the other person's mind. It says, "I know your inner world better than you do." And that is a dangerous move in any conversation. The moment someone tells you what you secretly believe, what you really feel, what you are actually doing underneath your own words, discussion turns into condescension. Now the atheist is not even allowed to report their own thoughts. And that is why this tactic backfires so hard. If an atheist says, "I do not believe in God," and the response is, "Yes, you do," then what is left to discuss? Nothing. Because now, evidence does not matter, reasoning does not matter, self-report does not matter. The believer has installed themselves as the official interpreter of another person's brain, and once you do that, you cannot lose. Which is exactly why it convinces no one. Think about how bizarre this sounds in any other setting. "I don't believe Batman exists." That means you secretly do believe in Batman, but you're suppressing it. No one would tolerate that for 5 seconds. Yet, in religious discussions, people say things just like this and call it insight. Usually it comes from a sincere place. The believer cannot imagine disbelief from the inside, so they reinterpret it as denial. That protects their worldview, but it destroys the conversation. Because an atheist hears something very clear in that moment. You are not here to understand me. You are here to overwrite me. And once someone feels overwritten, persuasion is over. There is also another problem. This tactic reveals insecurity. If faith were obviously true to everyone, there would be no need to explain away disbelief as secret belief. The very existence of the tactic gives away the tension it is trying to hide. And that leads to a deeper truth. People do not change their minds when they feel intellectually cornered. They change when they feel safe enough to think honestly. Which brings us to the fourth mistake. And this one is so common that many people do not even realize they are doing it. They treat conversion like conquest. For many atheists, the real issue is not a bad argument. It is the feeling of becoming someone's mission, someone's assignment, someone's project, someone's unfinished spiritual paperwork. And the moment that feeling appears, the whole relationship changes. Because once a person senses that your goal is not to understand them, but to capture them, every word becomes suspect. Even kindness starts to feel strategic. Was that compassion? Or recruitment with better manners? That is why so many former friendships crack under this pressure. The atheist is no longer being spoken to as an equal human being. They are being approached as unfinished business. A soul-shaped task on somebody's religious to-do list. And most people can feel that from across the room. The questions stop sounding curious. They start sounding loaded. The concern stops sounding warm. It starts sounding managerial, like a heavenly performance review where the employee is always under review and somehow never gets a lunch break. This is why so many conversion attempts create distance instead of closeness. The atheist starts protecting their boundaries, not because they fear the truth, but because they can feel the manipulation hiding inside the urgency. They realize the conversation is not open. It is headed somewhere. It has a target, and they are that target. And yes, sometimes it is subtle. The constant messages, the passive-aggressive, "I'm praying for you." The sudden flood of apologetics after someone opens up about family, grief, or doubt. The refusal to let the subject rest for even one normal conversation. None of that feels loving to the person receiving it. It feels invasive. It feels like their humanity has been placed behind the believer's mission. And here is the irony. Many theists think they are failing because they have not pushed hard enough. In reality, they are failing because they pushed at all. Real dialogue is not conquest, it is risk. It requires the humility to ask a question without already loading the answer in the chamber. It requires the discipline to let the other person finish a thought without mentally reaching for a rescue verse. It requires the willingness to hear something that may unsettle you. And that is precisely what many conversion attempts avoid, because the goal was never mutual discovery. It was extraction. Get the confession, win the soul, close the deal. At that point, you are not having a human conversation anymore. You are running a sales funnel for eternity, and nobody likes being treated like a timeshare presentation with hymns. If you want, I can also expand chapter 5 to match this same density and rhythm. The hidden reason these mistakes keep happening. Why do so many theists make the same errors? Because they are not only trying to persuade the atheist, they are also trying to reassure themselves. That sounds harsh at first, but stay with it. When someone meets a calm, thoughtful atheist, it creates a quiet tension. The stereotype begins to crack. This is not the angry rebel, not the cartoon villain, not the lost hedonist eating grapes in a nightclub at noon. It is just a person, sometimes kind, sometimes reflective, sometimes more morally serious than the believer expected. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If good, stable, thoughtful people can sincerely reject my faith, what does that mean? For some believers, that question is too destabilizing. So, instead of exploring it, they reach for scripts. They're deceived. They just want to sin. They secretly know. They were never real believers. They need more prayer. They need a tragedy. They'll come back. Those explanations do not only protect doctrine, they protect identity. Because once the atheist becomes understandable on human terms, disbelief becomes imaginable. And once disbelief becomes imaginable, certainty becomes a little harder to wear. That is why so many conversion attempts feel oddly one-sided. The theist appears to be addressing the atheist, but emotionally, they are performing for their own worldview, trying to keep the walls intact, trying to silence the doubt that says, what if this person has reasons I cannot dismiss? And that is why genuine listening is so rare, because genuine listening is dangerous. It might cost more than the conversation. It might cost certainty. And for people raised to treat certainty as virtue, that is no small thing. So they repeat the same tactics. Not because those tactics work, because those tactics comfort the speaker. That is the hidden engine behind so many failed attempts. And once you see it, a lot of conversations start making perfect sense. What actually changes minds? Now here is the twist. Theists are not the only ones who get this wrong. Anyone trying to change someone's mind can fall into the same trap. Religious people, atheists, political obsessives, vegans with PowerPoint energy, everybody. Because the basic mistake is universal. People think persuasion is mostly about pressure. It is not. It is mostly about trust. If you want someone to genuinely reconsider what they believe, they first have to feel that they are safe telling you the truth. Not the polished truth, not the polite truth, the real truth. And that only happens when they do not feel judged, cornered, diagnosed, or recruited. Which means the most persuasive thing is often the least dramatic thing. Listening, actual listening. Not listening while waiting for your turn, not listening like a lawyer, not listening like a man searching for verse numbers with the intensity of a retired uncle at a hardware store. Just listening. That is why respectful conversations between believers and non-believers can exist. And sometimes those conversations do change people. Not because someone got crushed by an argument, because they finally felt free enough to think. Several of the comments you shared point to exactly that. The moment someone felt heard instead of targeted, the conversation stayed human. In some cases, that openness even led people away from religion, not because they were attacked, but because honest inquiry was finally allowed to breathe. That is the part many conversion-minded people miss. Control does not create conviction, it creates resistance. Fear does not create understanding, it creates performance. Pressure does not create faith. It creates silence, politeness, distance, and eventually a blocked phone number. So, if someone truly wants dialogue, the first step is not better tactics, it is a different motive. Stop trying to win. Start trying to understand. Because the minute understanding becomes real, the whole conversation changes. And if it does not change the other person, it may change you, which for some people is exactly what they were afraid of all along. So why do theists fail to convert atheists? Usually for 4 reasons. They mistake disbelief for rebellion. They quote authority instead of establishing it. They claim to know the atheist's mind better than the atheist does, and they treat conversation like conquest instead of curiosity. But beneath all of that is something even more revealing. Many failed conversion attempts are not really about the atheist at all. They are about protecting the believer from a possibility they do not want to face. That sincere, rational, decent people can hear the same claims and still not believe them. And once that possibility becomes real, the script stops working. That is why pressure fails. That is why cliches fail. That is why the deep down you know line fails. Because people are not persuaded by being reduced. They are persuaded, if at all, by being respected. And maybe that is the real lesson here, not just about religion, about human beings. If you want to reach someone, stop trying to conquer the version of them you invented. Start listening to the one that is actually there. Because the moment that happens, it is no longer conversion. It is conversation. And that is the one thing most people were never taught how to do. If you want, I can turn this into a more viral version with sharper hooks and bigger punchlines, or into a longer 10 to 12 minute version with 7 or 8 mistakes instead of 4.